I now have the pleasure of introducing my very dear friend and colleague, Callen Anthony, who is professor in my department at Management and Organizations Department at NYU. She studies the role of new analytical technologies in the production of knowledge, and also studies the emergence of new technologies and technology-enabled industries. And she also studies the effects of identity on innovation choices. She's going to moderate the next speaker, and so I'm going to let her introduce our next speaker. And let's see. Oh, yeah, there she is. Hello, Callen. Welcome.
Hi, Melissa. Thank you so much. And I am very excited to introduce our next speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce Claire Tandy. Claire is the Innovation Product Manager at PayPal, and she is a Bay Area native, born, raised, and educated in the world of Silicon Valley. Claire holds a Bachelor in Engineering and a Master's in Management Science and Engineering, both from Stanford. But her intellectual footing is actually much broader. So Claire combines backgrounds in marketing analytics, classical archaeology, digital humanities, and design thinking to pattern find and analyze the human behaviors underlying technical systems. In her role at PayPal, Claire works to connect the dots between individual innovative action and scalable organizational change. And today, Claire is going to share with us how virtual innovation in teams has changed over the last 2 years. So this is something I have been looking forward to all day. For folks who are joining us, please use the Q&A to ask any questions for Claire during her presentation. Claire, thank you so much for being with us, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Professor Anthony. I really appreciate that really wonderful introduction. And I'm so excited to share with all of you today a few learnings that I've had in my role and working with people at PayPal throughout the last 2 years or so of working virtually. I titled this session a Quasi-Case study on innovating virtually across the 20 and 21 intern cohort. And this is really because this is the case study that I'll be looking at and sharing some learnings from today. But the underlying learnings are much broader and really come from the work that our team does in the innovation lab at PayPal. PayPal is interesting because we don't actually have a formalized R&D department. So one of the things that we look at and really try and prioritize is creating this grassroots movement of innovation throughout the company, not just localized to one specific team. And from this session, I'm really hoping you'll take away some best practices that we've developed, as well as just hear a fun retrospective story and understand, maybe see how your experience with innovation has changed over the last 2 years. So I'm going to get this off with a story that goes actually back in time a little bit further. In March of 2020, I was a graduate TA for a Stanford undergraduate course on innovation that had shifted, like everything else in the world, to an all virtual format. How to do really anything virtually was totally top of mind once that first email came out to the students, letting us all know, why don't you head home a little bit early for spring break, and we'll see what happens, later. But in the, frankly, chaos that followed, innovation was present, but highly reactive. The remaining school year was a mixture of canceled classes, postponed activities, and the one thing that I was now looking forward to was a now virtual master's internship with PayPal. My role at PayPal in the summer of 2020 was as an intern in their innovation labs, the team that I now work full-time with. These innovation labs are highly physical spaces located across the globe, ranging from Singapore to Scottsdale to San Jose, where people gather spontaneously, share ideas, attend training, working sessions, etc., to really try and bolster their innovative skills in their daily life. PayPal, as I mentioned, is unique in the fact that we work on these innovation labs and with our innovation team to inspire this innovation, which is one of our core values, which we define as creating amazing experiences for our customers, thinking differently, looking end to end, and practicing empathy by putting ourselves in our customers' shoes. The team I'm on specifically is responsible for increasing the creative output of employees throughout the company. We help our employees learn new ways to problem solve, with training workshops and other sessions. And we really focus on improving this ideation technique across the company while building prototypes on platforms like augmented reality, blockchain, and even occasionally robots. And what I'm going to share, illustrated from the 3 experiences I'll describe, are lessons that we've learned through 2 years of remote work. But moving gears again, back to 2020, instead of thriving in this in-person innovation lab environment, gathering with other interns on campus, I was sitting alone at my desk that I had frantically picked up from IKEA the week before they closed, before sitting down for a future of team calls, Zoom calls, all of the online virtual video calls that you've heard so much about today. And while that particular role had its own set of opportunities and challenges, one experience specifically that reshaped how I thought about virtual innovation was a collaboration experience put on by our university team. And that's the experience from which I'm going to share a few lessons today. Now, imagine, if you will, you're a small business. Maybe some of you don't have to imagine and work in small businesses or know exactly where I'm going with this. In any case, think back in your mind, and it's roughly July of 2020. The pandemic has been in full swing for about 3 months in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I'm currently located and from, and near Santa Clara County, which is the location of PayPal's headquarters, and which was also the very first place in the country to announce on March 16th, 2020, a full shelter-in-place order in response to the growing COVID-19 pandemic. All non-essential businesses have been closed. Big box stores are allowed to remain open due to selling critical items like toilet paper, and your niche business that often relied on things like corporate sales, farmers markets, in-person trade shows, and distribution to local specialty shops, all of which have been halted for several months due to the pandemic, is bleeding money. What do you do? This situation faced businesses across the country, including the handful who agreed to partner with PayPal's university program team to leverage our interns' experience to develop an innovative path forward for these individual businesses. While some companies had specific problem statements and others had kind of a more general one, this was the gist that united all of them. Help us get through COVID. Now, fast forward a year. It's July of 2021. From 12 months ago, a lot has changed. Since spring of this year, the Bay Area has been relatively unrestricted, having shut down and opened up with the rise and fall of cases. Santa Clara County, which 17 months ago had ordered the first ever shelter in place, has over 87% of their eligible population vaccinated. Again, another handful of businesses partner with the PayPal University program team, but this time they have a different ask. Help us figure out what comes next. With these 2 problem statements in mind, the what do we do now to get through COVID, and then the what do we do next to get beyond COVID, the 2 teams of interns, a year apart in 2020 and 2021, formed. Each summer, these 6 to 7 teams of interns had 1 week, while working in flash groups, which were optimally sized for innovation with roughly 4 to 7 people apiece, including 1 to 2 full-time mentors, to meet both years virtually with their respective business owners. And then in 1 week, as I said, on top of their regular full-time job, come up with a pitch deck to present the business owner with an actionable plan forward. A panel of internal leaders then would judge their presentations and additional output based on a 60-second video that summarized their analysis, recommendations, and next steps, as well as how innovative their ideas were. In 2020, I took part as a master's student in this project as an intern, and in 2021, I joined as a mentor as a full-time employee. In both cases, the groups I worked with had relatively similar backgrounds and demographics, mostly male, mostly software engineers, with academic backgrounds ranging from anything to about to be a college undergrad junior to an MBA student returning after a long career. Both groups also followed a similar blueprint when it came to their innovation process. And this is an innovation process that we identify and talk a lot about at PayPal and with our various teams we work with, because the thing about innovation is it isn't just the ideation part. You really need that communication to implement the ideas, and then finally that work to implement and get those ideas delivered, whether it's as a prototype or fully scaled. No doubt you're familiar with some of these from your own experience, but I'll take a moment to kind of briefly describe each of these and the outcomes and purpose of describing them. In ideation, you want as many ideas as you can. In innovation, it really is a case of quantity leading to quality. And I know Dr. Schilling has done a fair amount of work on this. Therefore, ideation and brainstorming, or whatever method you use, really is crucial. And next, communication. Working in groups has benefits, but identifying and using reliable channels of communication to communicate effectively really is a prerequisite for success. Identifying what those channels are when you're working in a group like this should happen early, and you should choose channels that lead to painless adoption. And finally, implementation. Think of this as the actually doing the work part. In these cases, the work of following through on the ideas proposed to understand which would be best to implement, making the pitch deck, and then creating the video. Simple, right? While these three components of innovation are present generally, I do call them out here because they're particularly relevant to see and identifying the differences in how these teams worked across the years. I think it's also relevant for this topic of innovating virtually to bring in a third comparison. An in-person, very pre-COVID in 2017 design project that I worked on. Though we had a slightly longer time frame of about 3 weeks instead of 1 week, the gist was the same. Work in a team to develop an idea for an external client's business, make a prototype instead of a presentation, and then create a 60-second video demonstrating its value. Now, with this additional example, we have 3 different cases where Flash teams work together on projects where one of the criteria for their evaluation was how innovative they were. Considering the drivers of innovation, virtual or not, let's take a look at how each team implemented the 3 key components of the innovation process and how they differed. So first, ideation. In 2017, our group in person was formed randomly, right before we listened to the company pitch their problem. We gathered in a room, in a couple rooms, and started talking about what ideas for the company might be. I'm sure you've been in a brainstorming session like this at some point where you're all frantically scribbling down ideas on Post-its, putting them up on a whiteboard, moving them around. And this usually culminates in you taking a picture of the ensuing mess on the whiteboard and coming back the next day to squint at that tiny little picture you took to then ultimately vote and decide on a particular idea that you are happy to move forward with. But the good news is this did lead to a clear vision that we all felt was worthy of taking to the next step. Now, by contrast, in 2020, though our group was also formed randomly, we met for the first time when we were all virtually added by by a university program team member to a Slack team that they had suggested we set up. Brainstorming in this case took the form of adding ideas and thoughts to the Slack channel, and then adding further paragraphs of thoughts about those particular ideas on different whiteboarding environments, whether that was a shared cloud document or a mind mapping tool like a Miro board or Teams whiteboard. Everyone had their space in the document, and we then used asynchronous but not anonymous voting, like the Post-it notes, to find out which one was the most popular. If this does sound familiar, it's a very similar process to the one that was done in person. However, because it was done virtually and by people who weren't extraordinarily familiar with these tools, it meant that it was done without the benefit of being in person to read body language and to assess buy-in and general consensus around ideas before the voting began. While this has benefits for reducing bias and reducing things like groupthink, it does also mean that it's harder to understand whether everyone in the group is willing to fully buy into the end result idea. And now in 2021, the mood was different. We met up first when one of the group members initiated a Slack channel for collaboration, instead of being told to do so by the university team. We met officially for the first time in the meeting with the business, but already had a debrief meeting scheduled to get to know each other and to start brainstorming. And brainstorming in this case meant following best practices, turning our cameras and mics off for 10 minutes to create a list independently, not in a shared document, before throwing them all up onto a virtual whiteboard and moving them around together. Once we'd narrowed it down to 2 ideas, we used an anonymous poll in Slack to vote. And finally, we had our idea. Now, if you take a step back and compare 2020 and 2021, you'll see a lot of the same virtual collaboration tools. However, the tools weren't used the same way for brainstorming. In 2020, the focus was on replicating the ability in an in-person environment to use a whiteboard to share, process, and select those ideas, like the team in 2017 had done, but virtually. By contrast, in 2021, you had a group of people who were very familiar and comfortable using these tools. They had been well trained on them throughout their experience, both in university and now working remotely for several months. It's essential for brainstorming for everyone to come up with an essential set of ideas independently. When you start from nothing together, all subsequent ideas tend to be influenced by whatever the first suggestion was. However, when you dedicate time to brainstorm independently first, this improves the quality and diversity of ideas and doesn't bias the ensuing discussion. But in person, this can be hard to do. You naturally pay attention to the people around you. How quickly are they scribbling down notes on the Post-it notes? I know I've done this. You always peek up and look around and say, oh, is someone writing more than I am? But when you turn your mic and camera off, you're fully alone, with the exception maybe of the pets and children that were discussed earlier. The lack of contextual information that does make the soon-to-be-had discussion harder actually gives you more freedom of space to truly think your own thoughts. Use this benefit to technology when brainstorming virtually. And in general, use the tools that you have to enhance aspects of the experience that can get lost while in person. Now, the teams have come up with their idea. And the second part that becomes important is further communication to actually work to execute on this idea. More specifically, discussing what the communication channels that we'll be working with are. In the 2017 case, the group members had everything ranging from in-person body language to texting each other on a group WhatsApp communication to asynchronous kind of notes and doodles left on whiteboards. But what this meant was in 2020, when there was no option for in-person communication, and the closest anyone could get was those video calls on which they could discuss shared face-to-face documents, this meant that asynchronous communication became increasingly important, whether that was a Slack or a Miro. Apologies for that. These were really the tools that everyone had to work on in the different times. However, this also meant that because most of the channels were these asynchronous or sometimes synchronous communications, it meant that it was really hard to read the tones of interactions. Is this one joking? Is this one sarcastic? Is this one excited or concerned? And there's not really an opportunity to get a sense of anyone on your team beyond the occasional emoji that they put into the Slack message. This lack of tone is a crucial difference from in-person communication, and one that I'm sure we've all felt acutely over the past year. This lack of ability to honestly even get a read on if you're landing with someone in the room or have failed, or if your audience has failed to understand a point you're trying to get across, is something that creates a fair amount of inconsistency and uncertainty, especially when speaking with an unfamiliar group. For innovation, one of the things that this is really important for is that inconsistency and uncertainty do not create psychological safety, a crucial component for effective communication and ideation. And now consider the contrast that in 2021, the team actually started using face-to-face meetings, first for that opportunity to get some read on each other. By structuring time for icebreakers, casual warm-up chats, and clarifying working hours, setting those limits and boundaries, as well as, sharing a few basic likes, dislikes, the team had a better sense of how to interpret the barrage of asynchronous communication that was flowing almost at all hours. Again, because this was a Flash team experience, not something we encourage you to replicate for all of your working experience moving forward. And I'll say, as a side note on this, in general for innovation, virtual or otherwise, and your everyday work, get to know something about your teammates. When you're meeting as a group for the first time, spend the first 5 minutes talking, especially if you've hired new team members who've joined a fully remote organization. This makes a world of difference in their willingness to share opinions, ideas, and to just get business done better. This is really about changing your mindset from we're wasting meeting time to we're developing a better read on each other and practicing communicating to be more effective. You'll amp up the psychological safety in the room as people also learn to predict others' reactions. And honestly, you'll just feel like more of a team. But now back to the other communication channels. Although I referred to them a couple of times as asynchronous channels, the 2021 team was much more comfortable going between synchronous and asynchronous for many of the real-time messaging apps that they used. While this does represent an evolution in the actual technology, because everything from Slack to Miro to Teams, as we heard from the Teams team earlier today, have made changes and have evolved their technology over the course of the pandemic. These changes resulted ultimately from people wanting to use these tools differently and learning how to use these tools differently. There are more nuances now to each communication method. And from frantic Slacks, real-time discussing, who should take a question in a meeting, to sporadic updates on different types of progress. And in case you're wondering about something that seems to have been left out, in all of these three cases, email was used almost exclusively for communication with the project coordinator, for setting up and confirming meetings, and for identifying what were major milestones that needed to be reached or presented. So for virtual innovation, my recommendation is find the innovation channels that are most comfortable for your team to use. What do they spontaneously gravitate toward? What comes naturally? And within those channels, it may sound simple, but think about what are you actually encouraged to do within them? Is it better for real-time or staggered communication? Can you use only voice calls or have messages send themselves later? So you might be up late working, but you don't need your team member to receive that email right away. Find a balance between the two to make space when you need it and come together when you can. Now, gone through ideation and communication, and you've come up with an idea your team is excited about. You've established effective communication patterns. And what comes next? The third component, and arguably one of the most important parts in actually having effective innovation, implementation. This is really the culminating step of innovation. And honestly, it's always hard. Two things that are hard about it: time management and equitable, not necessarily fully equal, distribution of work. In these three cases, implementation consisted of delivering a potential idea or prototype to the client in the form of either a presentation or a looks like prototype, and that 60-second video demonstrating the work that was done. While the timeline might be accelerated doing this in 1 to 3 weeks, sometimes it isn't. This is a generally realistic sprint timeline for many companies for a particular set of innovative related action. But in a lot of cases, you are looking at longer term goals, especially with proactive innovation strategies. You really need to do something like this. You need to come up with your ideas. You need to discuss and communicate throughout the duration of the project. And then finally, you do need to implement the ideas. In the 2017 in-person version, our client deliverable was a physical object to bring in and then a video describing the work that we had done. In person, our group fell back on tried and true methods for low-resolution prototyping, ranging from cardboard, laser cutting, foam core, maybe a bit of Photoshop, over several iterations that led to something we were happy to show the client. And the distribution of work was pretty equal because it was all done in person during this kind of Flash team experience. And I'll say from personal experience, When you're in a room and someone breaks out the hot glue gun and cardboard, it's pretty hard not to participate. And then to create the final video, team members divided the work by creating a storyboard and then uploading different versions pieces of the film that were shot by the individual team members to a shared drive, with one person volunteering to do some final editing in exchange for missing a few of the last prototyping sessions. However, in the 2020 version, distribution of work was, to put lightly, an issue. And I'll point out that none of these teams had any specific stated hierarchy as far as allocation of work. That was something that in some of them, a small version came up naturally, but there wasn't a kind of in-place existing hierarchy to rely on. The 2020 team challenge resulted in part also from everyone being slightly unclear on what the work required actually was, and then having vastly different standards to which they wanted the work to be done. This resulted in things like remaking presentations, rewriting scripts for the videos, and then reproducing effort in a lot of different ways. Opportunities for miscommunication are increasingly present when people feel obliged to make executive decisions on the fly without clear ways to communicate to the other members of their team. In one sense, this was a result directly from the challenges of the communication channels established earlier. However, it also came from the imperative to get something done in a short amount of time, something that is particularly relevant when working under a time crunch. Due to the virtual nature of the environment, the video was, in 2020, assumed right off the bat to be an individual's workload. While one team member wrote a script, and the other team members provided a few options for video content or stock photos to use, it was ultimately up to one person to, alone in their house over the weekend and working into the night, take the task together and make something realized. The group didn't have the opportunity to see the video until it was finished and submitted for judging. But in 2021, by contrast, the team members set up the expectation up front that they wanted to come together and put in what felt like an equitable distribution of work, up to and including the video. This meant that not only did we have more live working sessions on meetings where we would all log on with video on or off and work synchronously on different parts of the slideshow or documentation, we were able to do this with us. We were able to get real-time input from our team members in doing this. While this was, and I was deciding whether to say that there or then, but this was a more significant initial time burden since we were juggling several different time zones. I think we covered all of the American time zones and one or two others, and led to some memorable experiences, like one team member joining one of these audio calls from the New York City subway, prioritizing the Splash Innovation project and dedicating time to it during the normal working hours of the day made it something that could be worked on with more active engagement from all the team members at one time. And it also just made the experience slightly more fun. However, we also broke these sessions up. None lasted more than an hour and a half straight, though we did also have a few during the day. And we encouraged people to drop in and out as was necessary for them to complete these and other tasks. Conflicts were handled real time and stayed as task conflicts instead of spilling over into personal clashes. By working this way, everyone was able to feel like part of the team and like they were contributing and had an awareness and understanding of decisions being made and the work that was being done. When it came to the video, we got around the trickiest part by having one person work on it via screen share. While this can veer into backseat driving, limiting the length of these sessions enabled us to reaffirm the group's value of the effort and to make it so that no one had to work all weekend. So what's the takeaway for virtual innovation? Work together even when you're apart. It is not a waste of time. In fact, active working sessions enable you to see what others are doing in real time and to better understand the process. While this style of work is not required for every single piece, for instance, we did have drafts and we took and put together a slide before editing. It's a really important part of the process, especially for longer projects, because it builds trust among your team members for times when you aren't able to communicate real time. So finally, to recap, use virtual tools to enhance the process of innovation, not recreate in-person experiences. We saw this in ideation, where in 2020, the team attempted to recreate what works in person, while the 2021 team took advantage of the features of virtual work to reduce bias in their initial ideation sessions and in their discovery and voting process. In communication, when the 2020 team used tools that other had suggested minimally and shifted most of their communication offline, the 2021 team initiated contact on the channels they were most comfortable with, which enabled them to change between real-time and asynchronous communication, depending on the immediate needs of the group members and the project. And finally, in 2020, implementation work was redone and led to conflict among team members who didn't trust each other, whereas in 2021, work was done both together and apart, enabling team members to learn each other's working styles and develop trust and understanding of the group members' processes. While I've hoped I've convinced you on the benefit of using the tools you have effectively, I also want to take a really quick step back and note that these 3 innovation activities were happening in radically different contexts and with different motivations. The 2017 activity was a proactive approach to innovation, seeking to get ahead of the curve and develop something new, while both the 2020 and 2021 examples were reactive. The small businesses needed help surviving with their customer base disappearing and evolving from aggressive pivots to survive that they had just done during COVID. In both cases, the issue needed an urgent, actionable solution rather than blue sky ideas or broader creative thought. While proactive innovation, and frankly, all innovation, has a long history of being done virtually, as almost all innovation has been done in person because most of human history has been in person. On the flip side, most of the innovation that's been done virtually, at least recently, has been reactive. As we've considered how to innovate virtually, it's often in place of in-person innovation, a second-tier replacement almost to excuse the fact that you can't be together and to address immediate high-stakes issues. But proactive innovation is what keeps you ahead of the curve. If you're always reacting, you'll always be behind. So as we engage with whatever this new normal becomes, start asking yourself, how can I find ways to innovate virtually, proactively? Are there opportunities to use native tools differently, to create a hybrid model that can enable broader collaboration across locations, even without a reactive sense of urgency? And finally, how can you use new tools to gather creativity at scale and innovate for the longer term future, even when not in person? With those questions in mind, I'll leave you with the final challenge to do the following 3 things. Embrace virtual tools, when to turn them on and when to turn them off. Avoid the tech exhaustion, whether this is notifications from messages online or audio and video in a brainstorming session. Be mindful of when and how you're connecting virtually. Because there's a requirement to opt in virtual settings, that's easier to ignore when it's happening around you in person. Be intentional about what's on and what's off and why. Second, make time for that virtual small talk. It has a big impact. Shift your mindset during project work meetings from this is wasting our time to this is teaching us about how we communicate. Look to learn something about your coworkers that they're willing to share, of course. Even something as simple as, what's the weather like near their house, or if they're interested in any sports events that are happening currently. And if they do have a pet or a dog, make that pet get on camera so you can wave and say how cute it is. Sharing this basic human curiosity helps you develop empathy and makes you feel like more of a team rather than disembodied boxes on a computer screen. And finally, support it, but don't force it. For virtual innovation, find what works for the group you're in. Whether that's fewer or more synchronous working sessions, meeting daily or monthly, having purely social or minimally purely social time, teams are different. Recognize that it is hard to innovate virtually. Still, there are tools and structures that make it easier. Be proactive about group size, ruthless about time management, clear about communication expectations. And at the end of the day, some things will always work better in person and some will work better virtually. And now, as we move back to hybrid, don't try to recreate these better innovation practices in the physical world. Keep the learnings that you've gathered and build through this process and build from there. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to taking questions about this experience and innovation at PayPal generally. So thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Claire. That was fantastic. So we have a bunch of questions pouring in, but I thought I would just take a step back first and say, I really appreciated this talk. I really appreciated the themes that you brought up and how, you actually paint a really hopeful picture of distributed work and of virtual innovation, such that we don't just have to think about how do we, translate or attempt to recreate, offline onto online, but that online itself has all of these, its own unique features and tools and modes of interacting that themselves enable innovation in different sorts of ways. So, thank you so much. That's a very hopeful message and certainly resonant. So I guess, building on that, I'm curious, as a manager, how can you foster that comfort with experimentation with digital tools and practices that were important for, online and virtual innovation practices?
That's a great question, and definitely something that's really a challenge. And I think the previous speaker addressed this really well, saying that this shift to virtual has been a challenge for everyone, and managers especially. Working, with a distributed team who maybe was used to seeing each other in person every day, and who now you maybe haven't seen in over a year, and have hired on new team members who don't have that understanding of the previous group dynamics or communication. That's a really hard situation to be in. And I think for, helping to imbue this wisdom and teach these managers to how can you actually kind of build some of that trust, build some of that communication. I mentioned a couple of the tools, but I think starting with how do you as a team communicate is really important. And that's something that it's really important to address and take a step back and understand what currently is before you try to change it. So what I would say is for managers, take that second, even if it's an hour, for a week, to say, what are the emails that I've been sending? What have I been talking about on Slack? What have I been talking about on Teams chat? Whatever it is, method is that your company, your organization uses for that either real-time communication. Maybe it's text, maybe it's phone calls, maybe it's Zoom calls, Teams calls. How do you do most of that communication? And then when you're looking at kind of that's a way for you to step back and say, how is my team interacting? Are they interacting enough? Are they interacting maybe too much? And we need a little bit more time for that focused work time. So by taking that opportunity to get a read on what the current situation of your team is, you can make a more informed decision about how to then go about sharing that information on innovating virtually with them. Is your team one that's going to really enjoy kind of a workshop or a session where maybe you bring in someone from the company who has a degree of expertise in it to speak? Maybe you bring in an outside speaker. Maybe you lead a session, and show your leadership that way. Or is your team one that will love to read, a 20-page article that you send them and encourage those working habits? So I would say that that's something where it's really important to understand your team, understand what modes of communication they prefer, and find channels to kind of train and educate them that fit with what already works.
Fantastic. That actually segues nicely into a question that we have. Any particular strategies you would suggest that managers use for managing psychological barriers for managing innovation during pandemic times?
That's a great question. And I know one that we have all faced to varying degrees. It's such a big question, especially as the idea of wellness, of psychological safety, of how do you actually feel included in teams. And I know there are, a good bazillion studies that will talk to different aspects of this. And I encourage you to look those up because they're very interesting. And I don't have time to allude to all of them right now. But I would really say, at the end of the day, it comes down to recognizing that the people you work with are also people. They're also human. They have their own set of baggage. They have their own set of expectations of weird things that will make them more or less reluctant to speak up in a specific conversation. And it's really about, especially in a virtual setting, figuring out kind of what are different areas of flexibility, what are those areas of autonomy that you can extend to give people that ability to choose what's right for them. And it's something that's really, frankly, really hard. And it's really hard because we, especially in America, aren't necessarily used to or expecting, and especially with the last, there's been an increased focus and awareness on kind of your mental health as something that you need to cultivate, something that you need to, like your physical health, take care of. In the course of the pandemic, that's something that's been brought up in increasing amount, I'd say, more so than in previous years. But that's something where, in the business setting, I don't know that that's quite translated yet. So really being aware of, is there, a 2-hour block I need to have on my calendar just to decompress, to take a step back from work, to think about something else? Is that something that is enabled by having the flexibility of remote work? Or I like the dynamic work description from the previous session. So I think that that's something where you really, as far as tips for managers to kind of improve that, be clear about kind of what you expect. Because if it's something where you're sending me an email that I'm getting at 10 o'clock at night, and I don't know whether or not I need to reply to that, that creates uncertainty. That creates kind of that sense of, do I know what's going on? Are you expecting a response, or are you just letting me know and I can deal with it, tomorrow midday? So really being clear about what are the expectations that you have for that type of work, for the boundaries that you need to set. And with the clarity of expectations, providing the the specific space for your team to set their own boundaries and to say, hey, I go play volleyball, every week on Wednesday afternoons from 2 to 3. I need that for my time. I need that for, my mental well-being. Don't schedule meetings with me that I won't respond to them. That's an example that might seem silly, but it's one of the benefits of, especially in the knowledge worker space where you don't necessarily need to be physically doing something for an extended period of time. Build in that flexibility and provide your teams the opportunity to set those boundaries.
Fantastic point. And maybe, when we think about going back to hybrid, some of that, empathy and boundary modeling, I think is something I hope, we take with us from the virtual space. Another question. So a huge part of in-person innovation is chance encounters, unplanned water cooler talks with random people outside the team, either within an organization or outside. How can we simulate this or replace it with another mode for innovation and virtual innovation?
That is such a fabulous thing to wrap up on, because I think it is the hardest part. And that's something that I'll be honest, we haven't even figured out a really effective way to simulate and to recreate that. I think there's a story that's told about, I think it's the Bell Labs instance where they were, who files the most patents? And it was everyone who was interacting with one specific individual, with those chance encounters that in the lunchroom, by the water cooler. How do you somehow replicate that? And so a couple of things that you can do is, first of all, just reach out to random people in your company. And this, I will say, depends a lot on your company's norms as to whether or not this is something that is comfortable, that is appropriate. But having that opportunity to talk across silos, across organizational boundaries, even if it's not necessarily about work, even if it's just say, hey, I saw this post on LinkedIn by you. I thought it was really cool. Do you want to grab, 15 minutes to chat? Something like that, where you do need to be a little bit more proactive about it and be proactive about setting those opportunities to have those chance encounters, even if they're a little less chance. And I'll also say that this is something that is increasingly resonant as companies are more globalized. And as you have offices that are distributed across the globe, how do you actually create those chance encounters when you're not in an office and never will be working in the same office as maybe a portion of your team or a good portion of your company? This is something that there are, opportunities for random connections, or if you're able to meet in a talk or a presentation that you're able to view, it's an opportunity for you to be proactive. And whether it's posting a reflection on LinkedIn is great for this, by the way, posting a reflection, posting something you found interesting to start to build your profile, not just as, software engineer X in what level and what organization, but as someone with thoughts, about other things in the world because then people will start to gravitate towards that and start to just ask you about these things, creating that network of connection that goes beyond those physical encounters.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, we still have lots of questions, but I think I see Melissa, so our time must be up. Claire, this was fantastic. I've got so many notes all over my pages. I've learned so much from you. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing your experience with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much, Claire. And also thank you so much, Callen. You were a fantastic moderator. And Claire, you were a wonderful speaker. It was really a joy to hear from you. I had some questions I had lined up that I wanted to ask you, but we ran out of time, so I'll have to ask them offline. But thank you again for joining us. And I just want to say thank you to all of our speakers who contributed today. We had a really incredible high caliber level of speakers coming today for this conference, and I'm so grateful to all of you. I'm also really grateful to our moderators, Callen, Natalia, and Justin. You guys were terrific. I would be super remiss if I didn't say thank you, first of all, to Liz Chen, who did so much of the heavy lifting for this conference. So Liz, could you open up your video so we could see you? Maybe she's can't open her video. That might not be set up for her to do that. There she is. Liz, you did so much of the hard work for putting this thing together, and you were amazing, and it was seamless, and thank you so much. And I also want to say thank you to Doug Bleeker, who set up all the IT, which is a bigger job than you might realize, and he did a fantastic job. So thanks to those guys. Last but not least, I want to say thank you to the folks at Fubon who helped support this endeavor, and thank you to all the attendees for coming and sharing this time with us, because without you, there would be no point and it wouldn't be possible. So we are so grateful that you are here, and we hope you will join us for another one of our events coming up. Be sure to check out our website and our hashtag. We'll keep you posted. You can follow us and we'll keep you posted on events coming up. And that's it, folks. Thanks again.